The streetlight above me flickered, casting uncertain shadows on the wet pavement. I shouldn't have stayed at the office so late, but deadlines don't care about personal safety. It was just past midnight, and the normally bustling downtown area had transformed into something else entirely, something that made my skin crawl. The click-clack of my heels echoed off building facades, bouncing back at me like Morse code signals warning me to turn back. I clutched my laptop bag closer, quickening my pace. The parking garage was still 4 blocks away, and each step seemed to take me deeper into a world I didn't recognize. A newspaper tumbled across the street, dancing in the wind like a ghost. The sound of distant traffic had faded to nothing, leaving only the whisper of autumn leaves scraping against concrete. Something felt wrong. The air had grown thick, almost syrupy, as if the city itself was holding its breath. That's when I first noticed the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my own echo, but the rhythm was off. Someone was matching my pace, staying just far enough behind that I couldn't see them when I glanced back. My heart began to race, pumping ice through my veins. I took a sudden left turn down Marion Street, hoping to throw them off. The footsteps followed. I could hear them clearly now, heavy boots on concrete, unhurried but deliberate. They weren't trying to hide anymore. I fumbled for my phone, fingers trembling as I tried to dial 911. The screen was black, dead. I swore under my breath, remembering the low battery warning I'd ignored hours ago. A car drove past, its headlights briefly illuminating the street ahead. In that flash, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A second shadow, much larger than mine, projected onto the building wall ahead. The figure was tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and wearing what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. I ran. My heels clattered against the pavement as I sprinted toward the intersection. The footsteps behind me quickened, matching my pace with ease. I could hear heavy breathing now, not my own getting closer. The parking garage was still 2 blocks away. I wouldn't make it. A construction site appeared ahead, one of those endless downtown projects, surrounded by chain-link fencing and shadows. I spotted a gap in the fence and dove through it, tearing my skirt but not caring. My laptop bag caught on the metal. I let it go, abandoning thousands of dollars worth of equipment without a second thought. The site was a maze of concrete pillars and steel beams. I weaved between them, trying to lose my pursuer in the labyrinth. Their footsteps echoed from multiple directions now, the construction site's acoustics playing cruel tricks. I crouched behind a stack of pipes, trying to control my breathing. Something scraped against metal nearby. I held my breath. A shadow moved between the pillars, methodically checking each potential hiding spot. The figure was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, wearing what looked like a long coat that brushed against the ground. I couldn't make out their face, just darkness under that wide-brimmed hat. I waited until they moved past my position, then slowly began crawling toward what looked like an exit on the far side of the site. My hands pressed against cold concrete, feeling for obstacles in the near darkness. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, silently. A metallic clang rang out. I'd accidentally knocked over a small pipe. The footsteps stopped, then turned, started moving in my direction. I abandoned stealth and sprinted for the exit. Behind me, the footsteps broke into a run. I burst out onto the street, nearly colliding with a group of late-night bar hoppers. They jumped back, startled, as I pushed past them. I risked a glance back at the construction site. There was no one there. The street was suddenly alive with people, music drifting from nearby bars, cars passing regularly. Normal city nightlife had returned as if it had never left. My pursuer had vanished as completely as the eerie silence that had preceded them. I walked the rest of the way to my car, surrounded by other pedestrians, jumping at every shadow. The parking garage was well lit and staffed by a security guard who barely glanced up from his phone as I hurried past. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to get my key in the car door. As I drove home, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just some random creep who'd spotted an easy target. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me, amplifying normal nighttime sounds into something sinister. Maybe I'd worked too many late nights and finally cracked under the stress. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd glimpsed something that wasn't supposed to exist in our orderly world. a pocket of wrongness that opened up when the city grew quiet and the shadows grew long. A place where something waited, watching, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and matching footsteps with its prey. I quit my job the next day. No deadline is worth discovering what happens when those footsteps finally catch up. I should have known something was wrong when I saw the bus driver's face. He looked at me with what I could only describe as pity when I stood to exit at my stop. "You sure about this one, miss?" he asked, his wrinkled features creasing with concern. I nodded, already halfway down the steps. The doors hissed closed behind me, and I watched the bus's taillights disappear into the fog. It was only then that I realized my mistake. This wasn't my usual stop. The construction detour had thrown off my sense of direction. The familiar landmarks were there, but wrong somehow, like a mirror image of my normal route. The fog had thickened considerably during my ride home, transforming the suburban street into something alien and hostile. My phone's GPS showed I was only a mile from home. Walking would take 20 minutes, tops. But as I studied the blue dot on my screen, something moved in my peripheral vision. I looked up sharply. The houses here were different from my neighborhood, older, more rundown. Many had boarded windows or overgrown lawns. For sale signs stood like tombstones in several yards, their posts crooked and weathered. The fog seemed to curl around them possessively. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, the sound oddly muffled. Then another joined in, closer, and another. Soon a chorus of barking filled the night, but I couldn't see any of the animals. They sounded wrong. Too deep, too aggressive. I started walking quickly, following my phone's directions. The screen's brightness felt like a beacon in the darkness, but I didn't dare turn it off. The barking gradually faded, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by my footsteps and the occasional drip of water from trees heavy with fog. That's when I noticed the houses were watching me. Not the houses themselves, but the windows. Dark rectangles that seemed to follow my movement, like empty eye sockets in skull-like facades. In one, I caught a flash of movement, a curtain falling back into place. In another, what might have been a pale face quickly retreating into darkness. My pace quickened. The houses seemed to press closer to the sidewalk here, their shadows stretching across my path like grasping fingers. The fog had become so thick I could barely see the next intersection. My phone showed I was headed the right way, but something felt increasingly wrong about following its directions. A child's laugh echoed from somewhere behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. The street was empty, but the sound came again, high-pitched, gleeful, and completely out of place in this dead neighborhood at night. It seemed to bounce between the houses, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small and vulnerable in the thick air. The laughter came again, closer now, accompanied by the soft patter of running feet on pavement. I started to run. The fog swirled around me as I sprinted down the sidewalk, my phone's blue line showing I was getting closer to home. But the houses were all wrong. Victorian monsters with sharp angles and rotting gingerbread trim, nothing like the mid-century ranches that should have been here. The laughter was all around me now, mixed with the sound of multiple sets of running feet. I risked a glance back and caught glimpses of small shapes moving through the fog, darting between the houses. My chest burned as I ran faster, no longer caring about direction. I turned a corner and stopped dead. The street ended abruptly in a chain-link fence. Behind it stood an enormous abandoned building, a school or hospital, its windows dark except for one on the top floor that glowed with sickly yellow light. The running feet were getting closer. I turned to go back, but froze when I saw them emerging from the fog. Small figures, child-sized but wrong somehow. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, and in the dim light, I could see their clothes were decades out of date, dirty and torn. I backed up against the fence, holding my phone out like a weapon. Its screen flickered and died, plunging me into near darkness. The shapes moved closer, their laughter turning to something else, a high-pitched keening that made my teeth hurt. In desperation, I began climbing the fence. The chain link rattled loudly in the quiet street as I pulled myself up. Below me, The figures reached the fence and began to climb with impossible speed, their movements jerky like insects. I threw myself over the top and fell hard on the other side. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline kept me moving. I limped toward the abandoned building, hearing the fence rattle as my pursuers swarmed over it. The building's front door was ajar, heavy chains hanging broken beside it. I ducked inside just as the first of the figures reached the ground behind me. The interior was pitch black, but I ran anyway, letting my hand trail along the wall to guide me. I found a stairwell and climbed, my ankles screaming in protest. The keening sound echoed through the building, accompanied by the patter of countless feet on tile floors. I emerged onto what I hoped was the top floor, where that yellow light had been shining. Instead, I found myself in a large open room. Moonlight filtered through holes in the ceiling, illuminating rows of small metal beds. Each one held a shape under a sheet, perfectly still, perfectly child-sized. They found me there, standing among the beds. The laughter had stopped. In the better light, I could finally see their faces, or rather, the absence of faces where they should have been. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over childlike features. I don't remember much after that. The police found me the next morning, huddled in a corner of what they told me was an abandoned children's hospital, closed down in the 1960s after a series of unexplained deaths. They said I was lucky. People who wandered into that neighborhood at night usually didn't make it out. I still take the bus home from work. But now, no matter how long the detour or how bad the weather, I never get off at the wrong stop. And when I hear children laughing at night, I run. The first odd thing I noticed was the music. It was faint, drifting down the street like a half-remembered lullaby, but something about it made my skin crawl. I'd walked this route hundreds of times coming home from my night shift at the hospital, but I'd never heard anything like this before. The sound seemed to be coming from an old record store 3 blocks ahead. Its neon sign flickered weakly in the pre-dawn darkness, the only business showing any signs of life at 3 a.m. As I got closer, I could make out the melody more clearly. A tinny, mechanical version of "You Are My Sunshine" played on what sounded like a music box. That's when I noticed the mannequins in the window. They weren't the usual kind you'd see in a store display. These looked hyper-realistic, almost like actual people frozen in mid-motion. One appeared to be reaching for something on a high shelf, while another was bent over a record bin. Their faces were turned away, but something about their postures seemed wrong, too stiff. I quickened my pace, keeping my eyes forward. The music grew louder as I approached, and I could now see that the store's front door was slightly ajar, a thin line of yellow light spilling onto the sidewalk. A sudden movement in the window made me stop. One of the mannequins had changed position. I was certain the reaching figure had been using its right arm before, but now its left arm was extended upward. I told myself I must have remembered wrong, but my heart started beating faster. The music box tune skipped, repeating the same few notes in a broken loop. I hurried past the store, keeping as far from the window as possible. The sidewalk felt too exposed, so I moved to walk in the street instead. Behind me, the music stopped abruptly. Then I heard it, the soft scrape of the door opening wider. I didn't want to run. Running would mean admitting something was wrong, and nothing was wrong because mannequins don't move and stores don't play creepy music at 3 a.m., and I was just tired from a long shift and imagining things. But I heard footsteps behind me, slow, dragging footsteps accompanied by a soft clicking sound like plastic joints moving. The sound of more footsteps joined the first. They were trying to match my pace, but the clicking gave them away. I finally broke into a run. The footsteps behind me quickened, still maintaining that unnatural rhythm. The clicking grew louder, joined by a new sound, the creaking of plastic limbs bending in ways they weren't designed for. I made the mistake of looking back. 3 mannequins were following me, moving with jerky, puppet-like motions. Their faces were perfect human replicas frozen in pleasant retail smiles, but their eyes were wrong. Too shiny, too aware. I sprinted toward the intersection ahead, where I knew there was usually a police car parked outside the 24-hour diner. But the intersection was empty tonight. The diner's windows were dark, its neon open sign turned off for the first time I could remember. The clicking was getting closer. I could hear the music box starting up again, somehow playing from multiple directions now. More shapes emerged from the shadows of doorways and alleys, mannequins of all sizes, their joints creaking as they moved to intercept me. I ducked into a narrow service alley between buildings. My scrubs caught on something sharp, tearing, but I kept running. The alley was a maze of dumpsters and delivery doors, the ground slick with something I didn't want to identify. Behind me, I could hear plastic hands scraping against brick walls, getting closer. I emerged onto another street and froze. Ahead of me stood what looked like a delivery truck, its back doors open. Inside, I could see rows of mannequins standing perfectly still, their faces all turned toward me. A metal ramp led up to the truck's interior. At its top stood a figure in what looked like work clothes, but when it turned, I saw it had the same shiny plastic skin as the others. I turned to run back the way I came, but found my path blocked. The mannequins had formed a loose circle around me, their movements more fluid now, more confident. The music box tune played from somewhere nearby, but this time it sounded like it was being hummed by multiple voices. They found my uniform in the alley the next morning, torn and bloody. The security footage from nearby buildings showed me walking alone, no mannequins in sight. The record store doesn't exist. That building has been vacant for years. But sometimes, late at night, people report seeing strange figures in the windows, posed like display mannequins but moving when they think no one is watching. And if you listen carefully while walking past, you might hear a music box playing "You Are My Sunshine," accompanied by the soft click of plastic joints in motion.